much, and let me applaud all of you for having an interest in this. The school-to-prison pipeline problem really revolves essentially around, at its core, disproportionate racial suspensions and expulsions. And as you saw from the charts that were in the PowerPoint, very often this falls very heavily on students who are of African descent. When we did our research, we determined that in school district after school district, you could find that there would be disproportionate suspensions and expulsions of students of color from a number of different groups. But you might find that in some districts, the rates were proportionate as to their representation in the student body. The only group where we found disproportionate suspensions and expulsions consistently were students who were of African descent. It's really important to focus on that fact because one of the things that happens very often when problems that arise out of the communities of people of African descent is that there is a compartmentalization. We might deal with mass incarceration over here. We might deal with suspensions and expulsions over here. We might deal with police brutality over there. These things are all compartmentalized and dealt with as though they are separate and distinct problems. The fact is that they're all related. And in order to understand how they're related and why, it's important to put them into a historical context. So that whenever you begin to look at the African community in America, many times people will begin that historical process in the period of slavery. It's really important to understand what happened in Africa in order to understand what's happening here in America. An important and critical period to look at is that period in Africa between the 1200s and the 1800s. During that period, there was the commencement of what has come to be known as the global slave trade. And for those who were engaged in it, there was a necessity to rationalize and to justify it. And one of the things that they did in order to do that was to essentially portray people who were from Africa as being less than human. You know, it's a very difficult thing to go in and to say that you're going to enslave human beings and to justify that and to explain it to people who believe themselves to be good Christians, as many were in Europe. But if you go in and you say that these people were savage, these people were animals, these people would actually benefit from having close association with civilization, then it makes it easier to rationalize and justify it. What was happening in fact in Africa was that in Mali, what is now known as Mali, there was a university called the University of Sankore, which was the Harvard of its time. People from all over the world would try and get into that university. I mean, we have problems and disputes and controversies over admissions practices and policies now with respect to elite universities. They had them then. There were allegations that there was favoritism based on family, relationships, class, all of these things. But this was known as a center of learning. And so it put a lie to the assertion that these people were uncivilized and that they were worthy of enslavement. But nevertheless, it was recognized by those who were engaged in the slave trade that because of the brilliance that existed in Africa, because of the tenacity and the humanity of the people who were in Africa, it would be necessary to use brutal means in order to enslave them. And so they went into Africa armed. When they went into certain parts of Africa, they met organized resistance. And one of the places where they met the most fierce organized resistance was in Angola. Okay? During that time, there was a warrior queen in power named Nzinga. Nzinga was known throughout Africa as a queen who was able to stand up to the Portuguese when they came in trying to enslave her people. She had organized armies, military strategy that was effective and that was capable of repelling the Portuguese time after time. In fact, so successful was she and so well known was she that there were men from many different parts, many different regions throughout Africa who made their way into Angola in order to fight for Nzinga. You know, so beloved was she among those who were opposed to the slave trade. You know, the Portuguese got to the point where they could not defeat her, and they decided that they would invite her up to Portugal to try and have a conference with her to see if they could negotiate terms for the the enslavement of certain communities that she might be opposed to. So she arrived there, walked into a big stateroom. There were plush chairs for all the dignitaries who were assembled, and no place for her to sit. And that's how rough she was. I mean, she clapped her hands. A couple of guys went down on their hands and knees, and she sat on their backs and said, "Let's deal." So she was very rough, and she was overcome only by age and illness. And once the Portuguese went in and they were able to establish a foothold in that part of Africa, they stayed there, but the resistance against them continued unabated until the 1970s when they were kicked out, and they will not go back into Africa ever again in that form. So we must understand that this resistance is very much a part of the story that we see today in terms of how people of African descent are treated, particularly the youth. Because what happened is that a few years after Nzinga's campaigns, many of the people who were taken from that region ended up in Haiti. And once they got to Haiti, okay, there was conflict there among a number of different European countries who were trying to get control of Haiti, but ultimately, Toussaint Louverture, who was a self-appointed general there, managed to negotiate the end of slavery on the island of Haiti with the French. And once the French left, then they realized, they had second thoughts because they realized that they had holdings in the southeastern United States. And they realized that in order to protect those interests, they really needed Haiti as a staging ground for attacks and for other things that would be necessary to protect it. And they had second thoughts, and they said, we really never should have let Haiti go. So Napoleon was charged with going back and trying to retake the island. And he sent relatives and others and his underlings to go and to try and retake it. But what they met in Haiti were the descendants of those who were trained warriors from Angola. Right? So that when they came into Haiti trying to defeat these people, they met with such massive and fierce resistance that Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, and others who led the Haitian Revolution were the first to actually defeat Napoleon in that way, send him packing. And the French never got over it. They hold a grudge even to this day. This was something that inspired enslaved Africans everywhere. Because despite the efforts that were made to try and keep these kinds of victories a secret, all of the Africans throughout the world knew about it. And so it inspired slave rebellions even here in the United States. But even without the inspiration that came from the Haitian Revolution, the resistance by those who were enslaved in the United States was constant, fierce, tenacious. There's a book called Runaway Slaves that was written by John Hope Franklin, a great historian. And one of the things that he did in order to document this was to take an approach that's a little bit different from the approach that's taken by many who write history texts. He went back and used contemporaneous journal entries, diaries, newspaper articles, advertisements, and other records of what was happening on the plantations during that time. And what emerges is a picture of a people who were intent on gaining their freedom by any and every means. At every opportunity, those Africans who were enslaved were getting up and trying to run away from the plantation. At every opportunity, they would put poison in the master's food. They were breaking up the farm equipment. They were setting the crops on fire. They were setting the houses on fire. Even the women were involved in this. In fact, there was a letter that had been written by one person to another talking about her visit to a friend who had had a slave girl who was supposed to be attending to her. The slave girl was insulted by the things that this woman was saying to her and the way that she was treating. And she beat this woman so badly that her face became badly disfigured. And the letter said that she's unrecognizable and I don't know when she'll recover. That's the level of resistance. And because of that, it created for those who held slaves a dilemma. They lived in constant terror of these people that they were holding in bondage because they never knew when these people were going to rise up. They couldn't even sleep at night because they didn't know if these people were going to come in from the fields and set the big house on fire. And so in order to deal with that, they had to impose heavy repression on the people. Okay? This is where we get the tortures and the beatings. You know, most people who know anything about slavery, who looked at it honestly, do know that those who were enslaved were flogged. We know about that as a punishment. But what we don't know is the extent to which they went in order to torture these people in ways which are almost, the tortures are so horrible that it's very difficult to even talk about them. Just to give you one example of one of the things that was done in South Carolina, is that if you had a recalcitrant slave, one of the things that they would do is to put him in a large barrel. Then they'd nail it shut, and they would drive long spikes and nails through the sides of it. And they would take it to the top of the hill, assemble all of the other slaves on the plantation to watch as he rolled to his death screaming. Right? So that's just one example of burying people alive, soaking them in certain liquids and then holding them out in the sun, putting explosives in their orifices and exploding them. I mean, this is the kind of thing that happened in order to control this population, which was determined to resist and to seek its freedom. But this was not even enough, because what became necessary was the enactment of what were called slave codes. Slave codes were laws which established that those who were enslaved were not allowed to assemble in groups of more than 2 or 3. They couldn't go from place to place without a pass that said that they were authorized to be off of the plantation. They couldn't have in their possession certain types of musical instruments, most specifically a drum, because they felt that Africans communicated with drums. They definitely were not allowed to learn to read. Literacy was prohibited. They were not allowed to be trained in the use of poisons. All of these laws were put on the books, and very often they created for even civilians, people who were not law enforcement, the authority to take enslaved people into custody, to render a verdict on their behavior and to punish them, sometimes even imposing the penalty of death. So this is the world that America was during that period. And it has left an indelible mark on this society and on the minds of those who have inherited this culture that emerged from that slave period. And what it means is that law enforcement has inherited a practice of watching very carefully what is perceived to be a very dangerous population. So that when we talk about racial profiling, it's not something that just sprang up out of nowhere, out of the prejudices and biases of individual police officers. This is a custom, it's a tradition, it's something that's very much a part of our history. And it exists, it's there. And it's something that drives the decisions that are made by law enforcement officials many times, because when you think about the dangerous neighborhoods, the people who are likely to create problems, the people who have to be watched because they might do something, you always think about people of African descent. And that's where they go, that's where they look for crime, and that's where they find crime. If you look at the crime statistics, you will see, and you look at the actual statistics just with respect to narcotics, you will see that with respect to the use of narcotics among white youth is very often higher than it is among youth of color. Yeah, if you look at the arrest rates, especially for possession of marijuana, the ACLU documented this very well just recently in a study, which you're all welcome to see. You see that the arrest for usage and possession is always much higher among people of African descent. Okay? And if you look for crime in a particular place, you're going to find crime there. Okay? You can walk the street corners in communities of color and see people on the streets. You can pat them down, shake them down, harass them, question them, interrogate them, and find something to arrest them for. Meanwhile, white youth who are using some of the most exotic drugs imaginable in their recreation rooms or in the nooks and crannies of suburban shopping malls will never be hassled by law enforcement. They will never be approached. And law enforcement would never dare think of harassing them or busting into their suburban homes to bust them in their rec rooms because of the reaction that they would get from people who have power. All right, so this is our reality. It is what happens. It is what exists as the circumstances that create much of what happens with respect to the issues of racial profiling and over-incarceration of people. But it's not disconnected from what happens in the schools, even in cases where there's no conscious or deliberate effort to racially profile students of color. Because I frequently give this example. Hypothetically, if you have a middle-aged white vice principal, this man has black friends. This man has no conscious intent to discriminate against anybody. He doesn't think that he's racist. And in the sense that we generally use that term, he probably is not. But on a particular day, if he's walking down a corridor in the high school and he's approached by 3 or 4 16-year-old white boys, and these guys are keeping up a lot of commotion. They're hitting each other on the arm. They're yelling things. You know, they've got their music playing loud. They're, you know, saying things to girls as they walk by. I mean, they're just really carrying on. He looks at them and he sees himself. He says, that was me when I was 16 years old. How about that? Things never change. Boys will be boys, and he lets them walk on by. But then he approaches 3 or 4 black 16-year-old boys, and they're doing exactly the same thing, but somewhere deep within his consciousness, deep within the way in which, from the place in which he's been socialized and trained to think about people of color, particularly black males, the images of those slaves coming in off of the plantation, out of the plantation fields to set the big house on fire, are somewhere in there. He's threatened by this, okay, because their behavior is in no way, in his eyes, comparable to anything that he ever was or ever could have been. These young men are a threat. These young men are keeping up too much noise, and so he doesn't hesitate to do his job as vice principal, to go over and to approach them and to tell them, hey, gentlemen, you're keeping up too much noise, you know better, you need to go to the office. Now, from the perspective of the young men who've been approached, they sense immediately an injustice because they've just seen this other group walk by doing exactly the same thing, and they were not approached. And so then they start to protest, and they say, no, we're not doing anything that they didn't do, we're not going, so then once they start talking back, then not only are they guilty of excessive noise, now they're being disrespectful. And so when he insists that they go to the office now, when they flatly refuse to go because this is just unfair, then now they are guilty of insubordination. These young men are going to end up in the office, and more than likely these young men are going to get suspended. And once they are, they add to the statistics that we are all very familiar with about the disproportionate suspensions of students of African descent. It becomes very clear. And it happens, and it plays itself out in that way many times. Okay? Unconscious behavior that is fueled by a history that many people not only don't know about, but are even unaware of the fact that they're ignorant of it. And it creates many, many problems. These are the kinds of things that can be dealt with in a number of different ways by people who have training much different from the type of training that I have. But it is a factor, and it does contribute to these statistics. There are other things that contribute to these statistics as well. One of the things that is a very big problem is the whole issue of due process, which is a fancy lawyer word for a chance to explain yourself, defend yourself. Right? And when it comes to a suspension or an expulsion, okay, logic suggests that when they're going to take you out of school because you've been accused of having done something, that you're going to have an opportunity to explain, to defend, to make your case for why you should not be kicked out of school. Okay? This question has been placed before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Goss versus Lopez. Okay? And even though the court concluded that there is no constitutional right to due process, no constitutional right to an education. All right, they did hold that students do have a property interest in education, which means that they do have some rights to due process. If the state is going to take away your life, liberty, or property, then you have a right to due process. So they said you have, as a student, a property interest in education, and you're entitled to, quote, some measure of due process. Okay. That amount of due process differs according to how long the suspension is. So for a short-term suspension, which is a suspension of 10 days or less, The court said that you are entitled to oral or written notice of the charges that have been made against you. And if you deny those charges, an explanation of the evidence, the authorities have, and an opportunity to present your side of the story. Okay. Now, in practical terms, that does not necessarily amount to or mean that you're going to have a Perry Mason kind of a courtroom experience when you're charged with certain things that are going to lead to a short-term suspension. If you're throwing spitwads in the classroom and the teacher looks at you and says, "Johnny, I saw you throwing spitwads, okay, why are you doing that?" And Johnny has an opportunity to either deny that he was throwing spitwads or explain why, that might qualify as his due process with respect to that particular offense, right? And so if he's going to get suspended a day for that, because he's done that, 7, 8 days in a row, then that probably will stand up. With respect to long-term suspensions, which are more than 10 days, the court left it wide open, and they essentially said, well, if in the case of a long-term suspension, you're entitled to something more. What that has meant is that school districts around the country, and including Michigan, have all had their own individual opportunities to decide what that something more is. So that in some school districts, you're going to have full-scale opportunities to come into a formal hearing before the school board and to hear all of the witnesses' testimony that is going to be offered against you, to know in advance what the evidence will be, to have a chance to challenge and to test this evidence and testimony that's lodged against you, an opportunity to mount your own defense, present your own witnesses, even an opportunity to bring a lawyer if you want. I mean, all of those things may be in place. In another school district, you may have nothing comparable to that. You may have something that's just slightly more than the question and answer that goes on between the teacher and the student in the classroom that I just explained. Okay? And so there are no standards. There are no guidelines or laws which standardize the level of due process that is required in the case of long-term suspensions and expulsions. Okay? And in districts where you have high numbers of students of color who are being expelled or suspended, many times it's because they've not had the opportunity to come in and to really effectively defend themselves against these charges. All right? So that's one factor. The other, which receives a great deal more attention, is are those laws which generically have come to be known as zero tolerance laws. Okay? That's not the official name of the law that exists in any place that I know of, but it springs from a federal law called the Gun-Free Schools Act, which requires that every state that has schools that receive federal funds have in place a law that requires the practically automatic expulsion of any student who brings a firearm to school. Right? So Michigan certainly qualifies as one of those states, and Michigan has, as part of its expulsion statute, what would be regarded as a zero tolerance element. But Michigan's legislature expanded the scope of it. Federal law only requires automatic expulsion if you bring a gun to school. Michigan has expanded that to include not only firearms, but also a list of weapons, and also criminal sexual conduct and arson. So that the reach of this statute in Michigan is broader than it has to be with respect to federal requirements. So when you get down to what you can do about that, certainly efforts are underway. And ACLU of Michigan is certainly participating in them to try and reform that law and scale it back and to limit its focus to just guns. However, given the current wording of the legislation, there are things that can be done. For example, we have had any number of horror stories that have come to our attention about students who've been expelled for quote-unquote weapons. We've had, we had a student who had a Boy Scout knife in his backpack that was left over from a camping trip, forgot that it was in there, and went to school with it. We had an attempt to expel a kindergartner because he brought a toy gun to school. We had an incident where a high school girl had a small pencil-like implement with a small 1/8 of an inch blade on it that she used to arch her eyebrows. She was threatened with expulsion because they said that that might qualify as a dangerous weapon. I mean, there are all kinds of outrageous examples that we can give about that. But the fact is that many times when those efforts are made, either there's been a conscious disregard of what the law says, or there's ignorance about what the law says. Okay, because the fact is that dangerous weapon under the law is very specifically defined. It means any of the following: a firearm, a dagger, a dirk, stiletto, a knife with a blade that's over 3 inches in length, a pocket knife opened by a mechanical device, in other words, a switchblade, an iron bar, or brass knuckles. Right? And so it is possible to look at that list, and when they come to you with a kid who's got a toy gun, to say that's not on the list, and therefore that's not subject to the so-called zero tolerance requirement. The other thing that's present, and to the credit of the legislature, they built into the expulsion law the authority for school districts to use discretion. Okay? And so really, it cuts against what was intended by the Gun-Free Schools Act, because it was really intended to take away the discretion of the school district when it comes to these things. But they gave it to the school district, and if used properly, these exceptions that are in the law could prevent many of these outrages that we've heard about with respect to kids getting expelled for ridiculous things. So, for example, and specifically actually, if any of these things are present, if the object or the instrument was not possessed by the student for use as a weapon, or for direct or indirect delivery to another person for use as a weapon, the school district has discretion. They don't have to expel it. If the weapon was not knowingly possessed by the pupil, no requirement to expel. If the pupil did not know or have reason to know that the object or instrument possessed was in fact a dangerous weapon, no need to expel. If the weapon was possessed by the pupil at the suggestion, request, or direction of, or with the express permission of school or police authorities, there's an automatic requirement to expel. And it gives you a lot of flexibility. Okay? And yet we find situations where students are getting expelled for ridiculous things. And as it's purely a matter of speculation on my part, because I've never had anybody to confess to this. But I really do believe that what happens is that attorneys for the school districts many times are thinking from a risk management perspective. And they advise their clients in a way that's not quite full and forthcoming. Okay? And so what will happen is that the principal will approach the superintendent, who in turn turns to the lawyer and says, "We've got this case over in the high school. This kid showed up with this scout knife. He says it was left over from a camping trip. I mean, we have to expel him." And yes, expel him. You got to expel him. Zero tolerance. Your hands are tied. There's no discretion here. You've got to expel him. You sure? Yeah, you got to expel him. Right? And from the lawyer's perspective, he's thinking, look, if I tell these people that they can use their discretion and decide that this student's really a good kid, didn't mean any harm, didn't have this weapon knowingly, and all of those kinds of things, how do I know that this kid isn't really someone who has gone over the edge and who comes back tomorrow with that same knife and stabs up a bunch of students? Then when it comes out that we knew that he had the knife, and we let him back into the school anyway, boy, I can see the lawsuits coming. I can see the damages mounting. And so we're not going there. We're just going to kick out everybody who might arguably be someone who's in violation of this law. Right? And I think it happens that way. and many times with very tragic consequences. Right? So that is a reality, and something that leads to unnecessary expulsions many times. It has a real heavy impact on the students themselves, because once you're expelled, okay, you're expelled, right? There is, in Michigan, you're not allowed to say, oh, okay, I'm expelled from Ann Arbor School District, so I'll just move over and just go to school over in Oakland County or in Wayne County or some other place. You can't do that. Okay, you're out, you're out, you're out. Right? And the other tragedy about this is that I really believe, looking at the legislative scheme that exists in the state, that something very different was intended, but something very unintended is the result. The way that I think that this was supposed to work is that if a student was expelled, then what was supposed to happen at that point is that the Office of Safe Schools, which is required by statute but which does not exist, was supposed to make contact with this expelled student and tell the student that there are these opportunities for you to enroll in an alternative education program. And then once the student was advised of the alternative education options, the student was statutorily obligated, at the risk of being a truant, if he doesn't, to enroll in an alternative education program. And the parents were statutorily required to ensure that the student attended an alternative education program to ensure that every student, even those students who are expelled, are somehow still in a learning situation. What happened, in fact, is that the Office of Safe Schools was established. Okay? There were very few school districts who reported or were cooperative with the Office of Safe Schools in making known alternative education options. They got frustrated, and eventually when budget decisions had to be made, they said this office isn't doing anything anyway, and so they just slashed it, axed it, and it just sort of went off into oblivion, and there was no such thing. In addition, there was a question that was posed to one of the former attorney generals of this state by a school district that was looking at the truancy law. And they said, well, look, we look at the truancy law and the other statutes that talk about alternative education, and they lead us to believe that we must be required to establish an alternative education program in our school district. Is that the case? And the Attorney General wrote an opinion, which used various sources of law to conclude that no, you are not required to create an alternative education program. That opinion has been the basis for a widespread belief that alternative education is not required in the state of Michigan. And as I read that opinion, it was a very narrow one. I mean, it may have been that the author intended people to be confused in that way, but it's written in such a way that it's responding to this particular school district and saying that no, you as a school district are not necessarily required to create one, because there's nothing that says that this particular school district is required to do it. But in the broad scheme of things, in terms of the way that this whole education system is supposed to work, somebody is. Somebody's supposed to establish an alternative education program, even if it's not this school district, one that's available to every student. Okay? And as a result, there are very few of these programs that exist in this state. They're few and far flung. And only a few of them are even licensed or authorized to take in as students those who have been expelled from schools, which means that there are any number of students who are just out there in a state of limbo, with no place to go, no opportunities for any type of education experience, and it is one of the primary factors that contributes to students having the opportunity to become exposed to and involved in circumstances and situations that are going to land them in the criminal justice system. Right? So it's a very serious problem. Okay. One of the other things that works against a family that has a child who has been expelled is the process of reinstatement. Because even if a child is expelled for a 180-day period, which in real terms is a full school year, okay, they have the opportunity to go back and to ask to be re-enrolled. But the statute is very specific, and it says that school districts are under no obligation to help parents to do this. Right? And the requirements for making this petition are very specific. They have to be done after a certain period of time has passed, and they have to address very specifically certain criteria that would probably challenge even a lawyer in terms of preparing it. Because somehow in the petition, these criteria have to be addressed. They have to address the question of risk of harm, of having the child come back in, the age and maturity of the child's record prior to the incident that led to the expulsion, and a whole series of other things. And the absence, or the absence from the petition of a discussion of any of these criteria can be used by a school district to deny reinstatement. So you've got a parent who's barely getting by, who may or may not have graduated from high school, who's working 2 or 3 jobs, okay, who's got this child that they're trying to get back in school, certainly don't have the resources to retain a lawyer to help them to get back in, trying to guess when it is that they can go back and to file this petition, and then trying to put together something in the way of a package that's going to have this school district to look at their child and to reinstate them. I mean, the likelihood of that happening for many of these students is slim to none. All right? And so they continue to drift for year after year, even after they become eligible for potential reinstatement. All right? So this compounds the problem. Making matters even worse is the fact that for those students who are left behind, are students who are able to come back into school, even if they're not on the streets exposed to opportunities for getting entangled in the criminal justice system, they're still at risk even within the school buildings themselves, right? Because one of the developments as a result of much of the propaganda and hype about the crime problems that exist in the schools is the emergence of police officers actually on school premises. Right? And that changes the dynamic and the environment in the schools tremendously. Okay? Because no longer is a student simply going to school and making dumb choices like all kids do, and then facing the consequence, maybe, of going to detention hall, or maybe having the principal call up mom or dad, or maybe having to pound erasers after school, or to write "I will not misbehave" 3,000 times on the board. Now, because of their dumb choices, they may face the prospect of arrest. And this is something that presents challenges not only for the families of students who are enrolled in these schools, but also a certain level of concern among many people in law enforcement, and certainly among judges, who don't want on their dockets schoolyard fights, okay? But which is something that increasingly they're beginning to find. Police officers, really, many of them would rather be on the streets trying to chase down honest-to-goodness criminals rather than trying to deal with the paperwork and the hassle of arresting somebody because, at age 15, he decided to experiment with smoking 1 marijuana joint, right? So these are some of the issues that come up. And even if a kid's not making dumb choices, making good choices, they're at risk. Okay? One case that we had comes out of, I believe it was Central High School in Detroit, where on a particular day, there were 3 students that we represented, but they were 3 of many, who heard an announcement over the school's public address system, telling the students that if they needed to register for college entrance testing that they needed to report to classroom, whatever it was, within the next few minutes. At the same time that this was happening, the Detroit Public Schools Police, they have their own police force, along with the city police, Detroit Police Department, were massing in the corridors in that school, preparing to conduct a sweep, because they had received complaints that there were people from the community who were hanging out in the corridors who were not students and who shouldn't be there. So as these students were leaving the classroom with the student's blessing, with the teacher's blessing, to go and register for college entrance testing, they're walking down the hallway, they're met by a battalion of police officers who are coming at them and demanding that they turn around and submit because they were being taken into custody. They protested and explained that they were going to register for the ACT, that this and that and the other thing. We don't want to hear it, we don't want to hear it. These guys were arrested, along with scores of other students who happened to be in the hallway at that time. All right? In the immediate aftermath of that, through our informal outreach, trying to get the charges against these kids dismissed, it was like talking to a brick wall. And the only way that the charges were ever dismissed was when they actually had to go to court, and a referee finally looked at it and says it's ridiculous and threw out the charges. Okay? But in the meantime, the anxiety, the problems, the indignity that results from kids who have high aspirations, trying to do the right thing, getting caught up in nonsense, all right? And, I say this very often. I'm not in the Detroit Public Schools daily. I'm not in there all the time. And I know that school district has its share of bad kids. Every school district has its share of bad kids. But the difference between Detroit and many of the other school districts is that the actions of a few are magnified and presented as representative of the whole. And so that when I've been in those schools, I have found some of the most respectful, polite, intuitive, inquisitive students that I've ever met. There was an occasion when I went in, I got lost. Two students came up to me and they offered to take me to the classroom that I was trying to reach. They were extremely respectful and polite. When I've talked to these students, during special programs, when I visited their classes and spoken to them, they're alert, they're asking questions that lead me to know that they're not just interested in the subject matter, but they're thinking about their own futures and what they can do, all right? I had one occasion when I gave students a discussion, when I discussed with them some of the history that I talked to you about at the beginning of this discussion, and I had some students come up to me and supplement some of the things that I said, because they've done their own independent reading. Okay. So these are students who don't deserve that. All right. And it becomes really an imperative for us to act in a way that's decisive. One of the things that we have really advocated strongly is something that DRC is very much involved in which you saw the presentation earlier about, which is restorative practices, restorative conferencing. These things work. Okay? They're very effective. All right? And if there's any one significant contribution that can be made in the struggle against the school-to-prison pipeline, that one is it. Okay? Because it has measurable results. Okay? It has worked everywhere, and it rarely fails. Right? And the only obstacle to it is stupidity and ignorance. Okay? And to give you one final example before I close, when we began our school-to-prison pipeline work, we were approached by the Michigan chapter of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and they were looking for an opportunity to become involved in some way. At about that time, I was made aware of a bullying relationship that existed between two young black girls, and it culminated in a fight between the victim and the victimizer. Okay? And at the end of the suspension, the victim refused to go back to school because she was terrified. She didn't know if she was going to face retaliation and reprisals from the bully. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to have these girls involved in a restorative type of a situation. And by doing that, it might help to educate the school and the school district about the potential of this idea. And so I said, this would be a good project for NCBL to do. You know, if you guys want to run with this, you know, we've got someone who can facilitate the session, who's willing to do it pro bono. Just make the offer, you know, set it up, do what you got to do. You know, let's show these people what restorative practices can do. When they wrote a letter to the school's principal offering to do this, a lawyer came back from the school district's lawyer that began in the following way. We deny categorically that we have at any time, now, in the past, or in the future, will have or will engage in any form of racial discrimination. Please do not contact the school's principal again. All contact must be with me directly as the attorney for the school district. I'll let you just ponder that one. I'm still trying to figure it out. Thank you very much.